She was 53 years old, carrying a rifle older than half the men laughing at her. They had already crossed her name off the roster, already decided she was finished. A relic in desert boots, someone's embarrassing mistake, a ghost that should have stayed buried. Then the radio screamed. 2 miles out, an ambush, soldiers dying. Every trained shooter on that range staring at a distance none of them could reach. Nora Blake didn't ask permission. She just loaded one round. What happened next didn't just save a convoy. It collapsed a decade-long conspiracy buried inside America's own military machine. If you've never subscribed to this channel, right now is the moment, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning started the way most mornings at Red Mesa Proving Ground started, with diesel fumes, dry heat, and the particular brand of institutional arrogance that accumulates when too many decorated men occupy the same square mile of desert. It was 0610 hour when Nora Blake pulled her truck into the outer parking lot, the kind of truck that had seen better decades. Rust creeping up the wheel wells, a cracked side mirror held in place with electrical tape. She sat for a moment with the engine idling, staring through the windshield at the base's main gate, where 2 MPs stood at rigid attention checking credentials for the joint evaluation exercise. She hadn't been to Red Mesa in 11 years. It looked exactly the same. That was the thing about military installations. They resisted change the way old men resisted apology. Same prefab buildings baking in the same Sonoran sun. Same water tower with the faded unit insignia. Same stretch of firing range extending east toward the mountains, where the air shimmered off the hardpan in waves that could bend a bullet's trajectory if you didn't account for them. Nora killed the engine. On the passenger seat, wrapped in a weathered canvas sleeve that had been restitched at least 3 times, was a Barrett M82A1 in 50 BMG. 29 pounds of precision engineering, 15 years old, worn smooth at the pistol grip where her right hand had found the same position 10,000 times. The scope was a Night Force NXS 5.5 2056, its turret cap scratched from fieldwork, the lens covers cracked at the hinge. Everything about it looked tired. Everything about it worked perfectly. She climbed out of the truck, shouldered the rifle case, and walked toward the gate. The joint evaluation exercise was officially designated JCSC-7, which stood for something bureaucratic and forgettable. What it actually was, what everyone knew it was a selection trial. 12 snipers from 4 different branches competing for 6 slots on a newly formed Special Operations Advisory Unit. The kind of unit that didn't officially exist in any public-facing military document, that got funding routed through 3 different budget line items, and whose members would spend the next 2 years doing things in countries that would never appear on official after-action reports. The kind of unit that Nora had helped design 15 years ago, under a different name. The range officer's name was Sergeant First Class Dominguez, a compact man with a silver-streaked mustache and the look of someone who had processed too many people through too many checkpoints to be impressed by any of them. He scanned her credentials without looking up. Blake, Nora, DoD contractor status, technical observer. He stamped the form. Lane assignments are posted on the east board. Observers stay behind the yellow line. Understood. She walked past him onto the main range. She recognized the smell before anything else. Burnt propellant, metal oil, the particular tang of desert sand that had been compressed and decompressed by decades of muzzle blast. She had spent more hours on firing ranges than she'd spent in her own home across 15 years of service. The smell lived somewhere behind her sternum. The 12 selected competitors were already staged in their lanes, young, fit, kitted with current-issue rifles and modern suppressors and spotting scopes that cost more than Nora's truck. They wore expressions of concentrated focus, the kind that gets manufactured for observed evaluations. Half of them were probably performing their focus more than feeling it. Nora set her case down near the observer's bench and scanned the group methodically, left to right. She wasn't assessing their equipment. She was watching how they held their bodies when they didn't know they were being watched. Shoulders, grip tension, where the eyes went when they thought no one was measuring them. One kid, maybe 28, caught her looking. He leaned toward his neighbor and said something that produced a quiet laugh. The neighbor glanced over, and then they both looked away, the way people do when the joke is about the person still in the room. She'd been hearing that laugh for 20 years. General Victor Hale arrived at 0720 in a staff car, with 2 aides flanking him at the standard half-step behind. He was 61, silver-haired, built like a man who had once been physically dangerous and now maintained the silhouette of it without the substance. 4 stars. A chest full of ribbons that told a story he had written very carefully over a long career. He had a face made for cameras, square jaw, measured smile, the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that likability was a tactical asset. Nora had known men like him her entire career. They wore leadership the way some people wore expensive watches, for what it communicated about them, not because they needed to know the time. He stopped when he saw her. The recognition was brief and controlled, just a flicker behind the eyes. And then the smile came out, smooth and cold as polished stone. Blake. He walked toward her with his hand extended, loud enough that several nearby officers could hear. Didn't expect to see you out here. What brings you to the evaluation? Technical observer, she said. She shook his hand once. Technical observer. He repeated it with the particular inflection people use when they want to demean something without technically saying anything demeaning. Well, I'm sure that'll be useful. He looked at the rifle case beside her. That your old Barrett? Yes, sir. How long have you had that thing? Long enough. He held the smile 1 beat past comfortable. You know we're running current platform evaluations today, M2010s, MRAD configurations, some of the newer chassis systems. That, he nodded at the case, is a different era of equipment. I'm just observing. Right. He clapped her once on the shoulder, the gesture of a man ending a conversation, not continuing one. Enjoy the show. He walked away toward his command position, and one of his aides glanced back at Nora with the specific expression of a junior officer who has been trained to mirror his superior's dismissals. The evaluation began at 0800. The 12 competitors cycled through a precision marksmanship sequence that tested accuracy at 500, 800, and 200 meters under time constraints, with wind variables introduced at each distance by range fans. The conditions were realistic. The wind off the desert floor came in gusts of 7 to 12 miles per hour, with enough irregularity to demand constant recalculation. Nora watched from the observer bench. She didn't make notes. She didn't consult charts. She watched the flags downrange, felt the air against the back of her neck, and ran the numbers quietly in her head the way she'd been running them since she was 26 years old. The competitors were good. Several were genuinely excellent. A young Marine staff sergeant named Ortega was shooting with a consistency that she respected, smooth trigger pulls, proper follow-through, calling his shots before the spotters confirmed. He would have scored well in any evaluation she'd ever administered. But she wasn't thinking about scores. She was thinking about the terrain east of the range, where the mountains turned into a series of eroded ridgelines and dry creek beds that stretched out for nearly 4 miles before hitting the next access road. She'd studied that terrain during her drive in that morning, the way she studied every terrain she entered out of habit, so old she no longer noticed doing it. One ridge in particular had been sitting in the back of her mind since she parked. At 0947, a radio operator at the main command post pressed his headset hard against one ear and straightened very suddenly in his chair. Nora saw his posture change from 40 feet away. She was on her feet before the words came through the overhead speaker. All stations, flash traffic, this is Convoy Bravo 6. We are under fire, grid, static. Repeat, ambush at, more static. Then a voice that had the particular quality of someone transmitting while moving fast and keeping their voice controlled because control was the only thing they had left. Enemy shooter, unknown position. We have 2 vehicles disabled, 3 casualties, requesting immediate fire support or extraction. We cannot move, say again. We cannot. The channel cut. For 3 seconds, no one on the range moved. The evaluation exercise didn't involve live convoys. Red Mesa's eastern corridor was supposed to be empty, but the classified logistics convoy, one that no one at the evaluation had been fully briefed on, running classified equipment to a transfer facility 60 miles east, had chosen this morning to use the mountain access road that wound through the exact terrain Nora had been watching since 0600. She was already unzipping the Barrett case. Blake, Hale's voice came from behind her, sharp and commanding. Stand down! We have protocols for this. Your protocols are for 1,200 meters. She pulled the Barrett free. They're past 3,000. I said, stand down. She set the rifle on the bench, dropped to a prone position with a muscle memory that required no thought, and began the windage assessment. Hale stepped forward. That is an order, sir. Staff Sergeant Ortega stepped into the space between them, holding his spotting scope. His voice was controlled, precise. Sir, I've been watching the eastern ridgeline for the last 40 minutes. There's elevated position at grid 774, northeast face. That's the only angle that covers the convoy route at that depth. Hale looked at him, looked at Nora. The radio crackled again. Bravo 6, single shooter, high elevation, unknown azimuth. We've lost another vehicle. Hale said nothing. Nora's eyes settled behind the Night Force scope. "3,040 meters, slightly under 1.9 miles. She had made longer shots, once, under conditions that had never been entered into any official record. The wind was the problem. Not a single problem. A system of problems. At the firing position, the surface wind was running southwest at 9 miles per hour. But the desert floor between her and the target ridge created its own thermal columns as the sun heated the dark stone, and those thermals pushed the upper air current in a different direction entirely. She was looking at a minimum two-plane wind calculation across a flight time of approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, a bullet could drift. It could rise and fall across the terrain profile. It could encounter a pressure differential off the mountain face that no chart fully predicted. She breathed out, slow, complete. The scope gave her the ridgeline in high resolution. She worked across it methodically, not rushing, not hunting, just reading. Reading the terrain the way a reader reads a sentence, pulling meaning from shapes and shadows and the particular stillness that a person hiding tries very hard to maintain. There. Northeast face, 774 grid. Ortega had called it right. A natural rock formation, 2 large boulders with a gap between them exactly wide enough for a rifle barrel. The shooter had used the terrain intelligently, positioned at the back of the gap, not the front, keeping himself in shadow, letting the rock absorb any thermal signature. She could see the gap. She couldn't see the man, but she could see the angle. Wind? She said. Ortega was already at the spotting scope beside her. His voice was completely level. Variable southwest, surface 9, upper air estimate 17 northwest. Thermal drift off the mountain face. I'd call it 2 minutes right, but that mountain's gonna kick it. Agreed. She adjusted the elevation turret. 3 clicks. Then 2 more. Then half a click that she felt rather than measured based on 15 years of understanding how this specific rifle settled at maximum range. Call me a wind flag. Ortega watched the range markers. Flag 4 is showing a gust. Now. She let it pass. Waited. Flag 4 dropping. Steady window. 6 seconds. She settled her finger against the trigger. Not on it. Against it. The distinction mattered. The trigger brake on this Barrett had been tuned to 3.8 pounds. She needed to apply that pressure with complete evenness, no anticipation, no flinching from the report she already knew was coming. The crosshairs were on the gap between the boulders. She was calculating for where the bullet would be at 4 seconds, not where it was now. The thermal columns off the desert floor. The pressure drop as the round crossed into the shadow of the mountain. The minute drop in velocity from air density at elevation. She was solving a physics problem with a single variable she couldn't verify. She fired. The Barrett's report hit the range like a physical blow, a compressed crack that rolled across the desert floor and came back off the mountains as a flat, authoritative echo. Several of the younger competitors flinched. Hale's aide dropped his coffee. Nora worked the bolt, chambered nothing, watched. Through the scope, she saw a shape separate from the rock gap. Not dramatically, not cinematically. It simply ceased to hold its position. The way a person goes slack. The radio exploded. Bravo 6, fire has stopped. Repeat, fire has stopped. Shooter is down. I don't know how. We have no visual on the shot. Where did that come from? Command, this is Bravo 6, actual. We are moving. We are moving. Casualties are stable. Where is our shooter support? This is Bravo 6, who made that shot. Behind Nora, nobody moved. She set the rifle down. pressed her palm flat against the bench, felt the heat of the metal through her skin. Ortega, beside her, lowered the spotting scope very slowly. His voice came out quiet, like he was talking to himself as much as to anyone. That was 3,040 meters. She didn't respond. I've never seen... He stopped, tried again. In 15 years, I have never seen a shot like that. General Hale stood 6 feet behind them. He had not spoken since Nora fired. His face was professionally composed, but something in the set of his jaw had shifted. Something pulled tight that he was working to keep still. Nora stood up from the bench, dusted off her elbows. I want a debrief, Hale said. His voice was back to command register, but it had an edge under it that she recognized. Not anger, not embarrassment, caution. Of course, sir, she said. He held her gaze for 2 beats too long. We'll want full documentation. Weapon specs, your calculations, everything. Sure. My team will pull the range footage. She picked up the Barrett. I'd expect nothing less. The next 6 hours were procedural. Medical teams reached Convoy Bravo 6 via helicopter. 3 wounded soldiers, none critical. 2 vehicles destroyed. The ambush shooter, positively identified as a contract employee of a private security firm operating under a DoD procurement number that should not have existed in this region, was confirmed dead. The shot had entered through the gap between the boulders at a downward angle consistent with firing from Red Mesa range, striking the shooter in the upper torso. 3,047 meters. That was the confirmed measurement taken by laser rangefinder from Nora's firing position to the point of impact. She sat in the debrief room and answered questions from a 2-star named Holloway who had flown in from Fort Huachuca, calm questions delivered with the particular careful neutrality of someone who had just been handed a situation they hadn't been briefed on and were now managing in real time. Holloway kept looking at her file on the tablet in front of him, and then back at her, and then back at the file. The file was thin, very thin for someone her age with her background. She had noticed that thinness years ago. She noticed Holloway noticing it now. Ms. Blake, he set the tablet down. Your current status is listed as DoD Technical Observer, retired contractor. Prior service, Army, 11 years, administrative separation. He looked up. Is that accurate? That's what the file says. A beat. Is it accurate? She met his eyes. No, General, it isn't. He said nothing for a moment, then, we're going to want to look into that. I'd appreciate that, she said. Quiet, steady, like she'd been waiting for someone to say it for a very long time. By 1800, the story had moved. Not through official channels, those moved slowly, wrapped in classification and procedural delay. But soldiers talk, helicopter crews talk, and the radio transmission from Bravo 6 had been heard on a shared channel by at least 60 people. Single round. Unknown shooter. 3,000 meters. 1 shot. By the time the sun went below the western ridge, the story had reached 2 other bases, 3 secure chat networks, and 1 retired Special Forces colonel named Garrett, who had served 11 years earlier under a classified operational unit, and who, when he heard the phrase single shot, unknown sniper, Red Mesa, did something no one else on those networks had yet done. He typed a call sign, Iron Wraith. He sent it to 4 people. 3 of them went very quiet. The 4th, a woman currently running intelligence analysis at Fort Bragg, picked up her desk phone without hesitating and dialed a number she had kept in her personal contact list for 11 years, marked only with a first initial. N, she said when the line connected. It's starting, isn't it? On the other end, in a motel room 6 miles from Red Mesa, Nora Blake was cleaning the Barrett by feel in the dark, the way she'd done it 1,000 times before. Yeah, she said. I think it probably is. 3 floors above a classified archive section at the Pentagon, in an office that looked like a storage room and functioned as one of the most sensitive document management posts in the United States military, a junior analyst named Specialist Tron Min was running a routine cross-reference query when a flag appeared in the system. A flag on a sealed personnel file. The flag indicated the file had been accessed within the last 8 hours, queried by a user at Red Mesa with General Hale's authentication credentials. The file had been queried, but not opened, just checked. The way someone checks a lock they put on a door years ago to make sure it's still holding. Tran stared at the flag for a long moment. Then he looked at the file designation. Blake, N.A. Personnel file. Access restricted. Flag category, Delta. Category Delta. That classification wasn't used for administrative separations. It wasn't used for standard retired personnel. Category Delta was used when a file had been altered, sealed, and flagged for review by an authorized oversight body that had never, in this specific case, been formally convened. Tron pulled up the access log. The file had been sealed 9 years ago. The sealing authority was listed as Hale, VJ, General, DoD, Special Projects. Tran sat very still for a moment. Then he opened a new query window and began typing. Specialist Tran Min did not go home that night. He pulled the access log a second time, then a third, cross-referencing the timestamp against the authentication record with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between a clerical anomaly and something much worse often lived in a 3-digit time code. The query had hit the file at 1:23 hours. 11 minutes after the confirmed shot time at Red Mesa had been logged into the incident system. Hale had checked the lock before the dust settled. That told Tron something. Not enough, but something. He flagged the anomaly in the internal review queue under a routine audit designation, the bureaucratic equivalent of hiding a bright red object inside a stack of bright red objects. And then he sat back in his chair and thought carefully about what he was actually looking at. A Category Delta seal on a personnel file meant the file had been altered post-separation. It meant someone with sufficient authorization had gone into a completed military record and changed it, not added to it, not appended a note, changed it. Category Delta was supposed to trigger an automatic Inspector General notification when applied. The IG notification in Blake's file was listed as pending, 9 years pending. The notification had been generated and then quietly routed into a review queue that had never been assigned to an active reviewer. The queue existed. The notification existed inside it. No human being had ever been assigned to look at it. That didn't happen by accident. Tron saved his query results to a personal encrypted drive, the kind of low-profile, entirely unauthorized personal drive that junior analysts weren't supposed to have, and that everyone in his section quietly maintained anyway. And then he shut down his workstation and walked out of the building into the Washington night, where the air smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet, and the streetlights made halos in the humidity. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he took out his personal cell phone and searched for the public contact page for the Army Inspector General's office. He didn't call. Not yet. He just looked at the number. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and walked to the metro. Whoa. The motel where Nora was staying was called the Desert Vista Inn, which was the kind of name that suggested the person who chose it had never actually looked at the view. Flat scrubland, a water treatment facility, and the distant silhouette of the Red Mesa perimeter fence lit by security lighting. She had chosen it because it was 6 miles from the base and accepted cash without asking questions, not because of the scenery. She was on her second cup of bad coffee when her phone lit up. Not the call from Fort Bragg. That had ended an hour ago. This was a text, no sender name, just a number she recognized from an area code she associated with a specific person who had spent the last 9 years working as a civilian contractor in Albuquerque, and who was one of 4 people she had contacted before driving to Red Mesa 3 days ago. The text contained 9 words. Hale checked your file tonight, 23 minutes after your shot. She read it twice, set the phone face down on the table, picked up her coffee. Outside, a truck pulled into the motel lot and sat with its engine running for 40 seconds before the driver cut the ignition. She tracked it by sound without moving. The particular engine note, the way the chassis settled when weight shifted off the driver's side. 1 person. The truck was maybe 8 years old, not a rental. The door to the room next to hers opened and closed. She let out a breath she hadn't been holding consciously. She turned the phone back over and typed a reply. How long before he moves on the file? The response came in 4 minutes. He can't move on it without triggering a second flag. He's boxed. But if he goes outside the system, she typed, he will. A pause. Then, yeah. She set the phone down and looked at the Barrett case propped against the wall by the door. The rifle was clean. It had been clean since 2 hours after the shot. That was the kind of discipline that came from a decade and a half of understanding that the weapon was never the problem. The weapon was the one thing she could always control. Everything else was considerably less reliable. The formal inquiry convened at Red Mesa. The following morning at 0800, in a conference room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and recycled air. General Holloway chaired it. Hale sat to his left, flanked by his JAG officer and one of his aides. Nora sat across from them with no representation, which was her choice. She had been offered a JAG officer of her own and declined, because JAG officers had institutional loyalties that didn't always align with truth-telling, and right now truth-telling was the only leverage she had. Holloway opened with procedural language. Who was present, what the inquiry covered, the parameters of the review. Hale looked at Nora exactly once when she walked in. Then he looked at a point approximately 4 inches above her head for the remainder of the opening statement, which was a technique she had seen him use before, a way of signaling to everyone in the room that the person across from him was not worth the effort of actual focus. She had seen him do it to 2 other people in her career. Both of them had made the mistake of believing it. Ms. Blake, Holloway folded his hands on the table. Yesterday's action at Grid 774 has been preliminarily confirmed as a lawful defensive engagement under emergency circumstances. The shooter you neutralized has been identified as an employee of Meridian Strategic Services, operating under contract number, he looked at a document, DOD 7741 Echo, which is currently under separate review. That's not what this inquiry is about. I understand. What this inquiry is about is your presence at Red Mesa, your weapon, your credentials, and, he paused, some questions about your service record that came up in the aftermath. Hale shifted in his chair. My service record, Nora said. Your file indicates an administrative separation after 11 years of service. Standard separation, no citations, no commendations, no documented operational history beyond basic training and 2 stateside assignments. He looked up from the document. Given what you demonstrated yesterday, I think we can agree that file is incomplete. The word landed in the room with the weight of an understatement so significant it qualified as its own kind of confrontation. Hale's JAG officer leaned in and murmured something. Hale listened without expression. Incomplete, Nora said. That's one word for it. What word would you use? She considered the question the way she considered wind. Patiently, with total attention. Fabricated, she said. Deliberately and systematically fabricated over a period of approximately 9 years, with the specific intent of removing any evidentiary record of my operational history. Nobody spoke. Hale's aide wrote something on a notepad. Holloway looked at Hale. General, is there anything you'd like to say at this point in the inquiry? I think, Hale said, with the measured cadence of a man who had given testimony before and understood its rhythms, that Ms. Blake's characterization of her own service file is something that would require independent documentation to support. A claim is not the same as evidence. No, Nora said, it isn't. She reached into the bag on the floor beside her chair and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Standard letter envelope, Manila, with a handwritten date in the upper right corner, a date 9 years old. That's a copy, she said. I kept copies of everything. She had not planned on playing that card today. That was the honest truth of it, and the honest truth mattered to her even when, especially when, it was inconvenient. She had intended to let the inquiry run its course, let Holloway's people pull the threads they were already pulling, and stay patient. Patience had always been her primary tactical advantage. People like Hale moved fast because they were accustomed to controlling timelines. Her entire career had been built on the understanding that the person who moved last moved best. But she had seen Hale's eyes flick to the envelope the moment it hit the table, and what she saw in them was not alarm, it was calculation. He was already running angles, already deciding which version of events could absorb the existence of that document and survive. She had seen that calculation before, in a briefing room in a country she wasn't supposed to have been in 9 years ago, 2 hours before her career officially ended. She placed a second envelope beside the first, then a third. Hale's JAG officer stopped writing. I kept copies of everything, Nora said again, quietly. The original mission logs from Operation Sandglass, authenticated with unit command codes. Satellite imagery pull requests from the 48 hours preceding the Tharsis Valley engagement. Requests I submitted that were denied without reason. After action reports I wrote that were subsequently filed under a different officer's name. She paused. And 3 sets of orders, signed and countersigned, that were never entered into the official record. Orders that sent 6 operators into a situation they were not equipped to handle, because the intelligence I provided was deliberately withheld from the mission brief. The room had gone very still. Holloway was looking at the envelopes. The way people look at something they suddenly understand is much heavier than it appears. Hale said, These are extraordinary claims that require General. Holloway's voice was not loud, but it stopped Hale the way a hand signal stops a column. He looked at the envelopes, then at Nora. How long have you had these documents? 9 years, she said. I've been waiting for the right question. The inquiry was suspended at 10:40 for what Holloway's aide described as administrative recalibration, which was the institutional way of saying that something had just happened that required phone calls to people who outranked everyone in the room. Nora was asked to remain on base, which was a request framed as a courtesy and understood by both parties as something closer to a requirement. She was given a room in the visiting officers' quarters, clean, small, with a window that looked out over the main parade ground. She didn't unpack. She sat on the bed and called the woman at Fort Bragg. Inquiry suspended, she said when the line picked up. Already? I put the documents on the table. A beat of silence. All of them? The first 3 sets. I kept the signals intercepts back. Smart. The woman's name was Dana Reyes, and she had spent 11 years carrying the same weight Nora carried, the specific weight of knowing something true that no one with authority wanted to be true. She had survived it by going into intelligence analysis, where the value of information was measured by its accuracy rather than its convenience, and where she had spent 9 years quietly building a parallel record of everything she remembered. How did Hale react? Like a man running numbers. That's worse than panic. I know. Nora. A pause. If he goes outside the system, I know. He has people who are not inside any inquiry room. He has people who handle things that don't appear in reports. I know, Dana. A longer pause. Are you staying on base? They asked me to. That's not what I asked. Nora looked at the window. The parade ground was empty in the midday heat, just concrete and flagpoles and the particular austere geometry of military infrastructure that she had grown up inside of and never quite left, even when it ejected her. Yeah, she said. I'm staying. Watch your back. Always. At 1340, Staff Sergeant Ortega found her in the base cafeteria, where she was eating a sandwich that tasted like the institutional memory of sandwiches, technically food, recognizable as lunch, entirely without joy. He set his tray down across from her without asking and sat. She looked at him. I looked you up, he said. Find anything? That's the thing. He cut his food with the focused economy of someone who used physical actions to manage what he was thinking. I found almost nothing. 11 years of service, 2 stateside postings, administrative separation, no operational assignments, no marksmanship records, no citations. He looked up. For someone who just made a 3,047-meter shot, that file doesn't make sense. No, she said. It doesn't. I've been shooting for 14 years. I've trained under some of the best long-range instructors in the Army. He set down his fork. What you did yesterday. I can count on one hand the number of people I've ever seen who could theoretically attempt that shot. I can count on 0 fingers the number who'd make it cold, in variable wind, with a platform that old, without a confirmed range. He paused. Who are you? She ate for a moment. Outside the cafeteria windows, 2 military police vehicles crossed the lot at a pace that was not quite routine. I was a sniper, she said. Special operations support, assigned to a classified unit out of Fort Carson that doesn't appear in any public-facing document. 12 operational deployments between 2004 and 2015. Confirmed engagements that I won't enumerate. And then 9 years ago, I submitted an intelligence report that contradicted a decision someone very powerful had already made, and my career was surgically removed from the historical record. Ortega was quiet for a moment. Hale. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. He was running special operations procurement in 2015, Ortega said. It wasn't a question. He'd done his research and done it fast. She filed that away. There was a contractor audit that year. I was a junior sergeant. I only heard pieces of it. A procurement investigation that got buried. Something about contract irregularities in the Tharsis operation. That's accurate. The audit got buried. Also accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. What happens now? She finished her sandwich. Now we see how far he's willing to go. What happened next came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated, which was unusual and therefore worth examining. At 15:20, Holloway's aide knocked on her door in the visiting officer's quarters and delivered a message. The inquiry would resume the following morning at 0900, and in the interim, all personnel connected to the incident were asked to limit communications to base channels. Limit communications to base channels. That was new. She thought about it for 11 minutes. She counted. Because when she was working a problem, she always counted. It kept the mind from running ahead of the evidence. And then she understood what it actually meant. Limiting communications to base channels meant all external calls would route through the base switchboard. The base switchboard was monitored by the base communications officer. The base communications officer reported to the base commander. The base commander was a two-star who had served 2 tours under Hale's command in the early 2010s. She wasn't being protected. She was being isolated. She sat with that understanding for a moment. Let it settle. Then she made a decision that she knew was a risk and made it anyway, because in her experience, the moments when caution felt safest were often the moments it was most dangerous. She walked to the base's public affairs office, which was staffed by a single PFC who was 22 years old and deeply absorbed in a scheduling spreadsheet, and asked to use the landline to call her attorney in Phoenix. She did not have an attorney in Phoenix. What she had in Phoenix was a retired Army counterintelligence officer named Marcus Webb, who had spent 23 years identifying when institutions turned against the people inside them, and who had been her contact for operational security matters for the last 4 years. The PFC plugged in headphones and went back to the spreadsheet. Nora dialed. Webb picked up on the second ring. "Tell me you're not calling from base," he said. "I'm calling from base." "Nora, they're limiting external comms. I needed you to know. The documents are out. Holloway has them. The inquiry is moving faster than I expected, which means Hale is running out of time on the institutional track." She kept her voice low and even. "Which means he's going to move to the other track." A beat. Then, carefully, "How soon?" 48 hours, maybe less. You need to get off that base." "I can't. If I leave, I lose the inquiry." "If you stay, Marcus." She said his name with the specific weight of someone who had already run the calculation and wasn't interested in running it again. "I know. I've been running this kind of risk for 15 years. The difference is that now it's in a room with other people watching." A long pause on the line. "The signal's intercepts. You still have them?" "Safe, off-site." "Keep them that way." He exhaled. "All right. I'm making 2 calls tonight. You won't know who they're to, and I'm not going to tell you. But if something happens on that base in the next 48 hours, there will be people who know to ask questions. That's all I need. Be careful." She hung up and thanked the PFC, who had not looked up once. That night, General Hale did not sleep. This was not unusual for him. He was a man who ran on controlled stimulation and strategic anxiety, who had spent 4 decades converting stress into motion. But tonight the motion had nowhere useful to go. He sat at the desk in his base quarters with his laptop open and a glass of bourbon untouched beside it, reading the preliminary inquiry summary that his JAG officer had forwarded 2 hours ago. He read it the way he read all intelligence, looking for the shape of what wasn't there as much as what was. The documents Nora had put on the table were copies. She had said so herself. Copies meant originals existed somewhere. Originals with authentication codes were admissible. Copies without verified chain of custody could be challenged, contested, subjected to the kind of procedural friction that could delay an inquiry for months. He had done it before. But the signals intercepts. She had mentioned signals intercepts and then not produced them, which meant she was holding them, which meant she understood their value, that they were the most operationally damaging piece of documentation possible, because signals intercepts couldn't be explained away by chain of custody arguments. They were raw data, time-stamped, protocol-stamped. They either said what they said or they didn't. He had spent 9 years believing those intercepts no longer existed. He stared at the screen. His phone rang. Private number, no ID. He looked at it for 3 rings, picked up. "You have a problem," said the voice on the other end. Male, older, with the flat effect of someone who had spent a career discussing problems without emotional investment in them. "The inquiry is moving faster than the containment window." "I'm aware. The documents she produced today, I'm handling the documents." "You're not handling the intercepts." Hale picked up the bourbon glass, set it back down without drinking. "She may not have them." She referenced them. Referencing and having are different things. A silence. Then, "Are you willing to bet your stars on that distinction?" He didn't answer. "There's a practical solution," the voice said. "Clean, documentable as an administrative action, completely defensible in any subsequent review." "Tell me," the voice told him. When the call ended, Hale sat for a moment with the phone still in his hand. Then he set it down, opened his laptop, and began drafting an order. Nora woke at 0400 without an alarm. She had never reliably used alarms, her body having calibrated itself over years of operations to surface at whatever time she had mentally designated before sleep. She lay still for 60 seconds, tracking the sounds of the base, the distant idle of a generator, a vehicle passing on the perimeter road. Nothing irregular. She got up, dressed in the dark, and went to the window. The parade ground was empty except for one figure, a soldier in PT gear running the perimeter road at a steady pace, headlamp on, earbuds in, probably doing their mandatory morning mileage. She watched until the runner disappeared behind the motor pool building. Then she looked at her phone. 3 missed calls, all from a number she didn't recognize, no voicemails. She cross-referenced the number against the mental index she maintained, a habit she had never been able to fully turn off, and didn't place it. She was still looking at the screen when someone knocked on her door. Not a maintenance knock, not a courtesy knock. The specific, controlled, triple knock of someone delivering official notification. She opened the door. 2 MPs stood in the corridor, both in full-duty gear, expressions professional and blank. Behind them, slightly back, was Hale's aide, the same one who had looked at her with second-hand dismissal on the first morning. He was holding a single sheet of paper. "Ms. Blake," he said, "I have an order here rescinding your base access credentials, effective immediately, pursuant to General Hale's authority as senior officer on station." He held it out. "You're being asked to vacate the visiting officer's quarters and depart the installation within the next 2 hours." Nora looked at the paper. She did not take it. "The inquiry reconvenes at 0900, she said. "The inquiry has been reclassified," the aide said. He had the tone of a man reading from a script he hadn't written and wasn't fully comfortable with. "Under General Hale's authority, it's been elevated to a restricted proceeding. Civilian participants have been removed from the witness list pending credential review." She looked past him at the 2 MPs. One of them, young, maybe 23, standing slightly straighter than the situation required, met her eyes for 1 second and then looked at a point past her shoulder. He knew. Not everything, but enough to be uncomfortable standing in this corridor at 0400 doing this particular job. "Tell General Hale," Nora said, her voice completely level, "that removing me from the base doesn't remove the documents from the inquiry record. They're in Holloway's possession. Holloway outranks him. General Holloway has been recalled to Fort Huachuca on a separate matter." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. She had miscalculated the speed. She had expected 48 hours. Hale had moved in 18. She took the paper, read it fully, every line. Then she folded it once, placed it in her jacket pocket, and looked at the aide with an expression that people who knew her well would have recognized as the one she wore when she had just finished running numbers and arrived at a conclusion she found satisfying. 2 hours, she said. "Yes, ma'am." She closed the door, stood in the center of the dark room for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized 4 years ago and never expected to use this quickly. It rang once. A voice answered. Alert, awake, as if the person on the other end had been sitting by the phone waiting for it to ring, and said simply, "How bad?" "He moved on Holloway," Nora said. A pause. Then the voice said, "The intercepts. I need them authenticated and in front of someone Hale can't move, tonight." "That's a short window." "I know." "Nora." A breath. If we push the intercepts out now, there's no taking it back. Whatever those transmissions show, it's going to go places we can't control. Good, she said. That's exactly what I want. The 2 hours they gave her, she used every minute of. Not packing. The bag was packed in 4 minutes, same as always, the Barrett case latched and ready before she'd finished her first cup of water from the tap. What she used the remaining time for was thinking, which looked from the outside like nothing at all. A woman sitting on the edge of an unmade bed in a dark room with her hands loose in her lap and her eyes on a fixed point on the wall. She was building the sequence. Hale had moved on Holloway, gotten him recalled, pulled him off the inquiry before the documents could be formally entered into a protected record. That meant Hale still had reach inside the logistics chain that controlled officer assignments and temporary duty orders. That reach required either a very cooperative ally at a senior level or a fabricated operational requirement convincing enough to survive initial scrutiny. Either way, it told her something. He wasn't acting alone tonight, and he was moving with the kind of confidence that came from believing he still held the high ground. He was wrong about the high ground, but he didn't know that yet. At 0537, she walked out of the visiting officer's quarters with the Barrett case over her shoulder and her bag in her left hand and crossed the base toward the motor pool, where her truck was parked in the civilian contractor lot behind the equipment shed. The base was beginning its morning cycle, lights coming on in the barracks, the smell of the mess hall starting up, a detail of soldiers in PT formation moving in the distance at a pace that meant their sergeant wasn't satisfied with yesterday's time. Normal. Deliberate. Unhurried. She loaded the truck without speaking to anyone and drove to the main gate, where the same MP who had processed her 3 days ago was running the early shift. He checked her credentials, saw the revocation notation. "Ma'am, your base access has been revoked, I know." She handed him the signed expulsion order from Hale's aide. "I'm leaving voluntarily. That's what this says." He studied it, looked at her, looked at the document again. He was thorough, which she respected, and visibly uncomfortable, which she also understood. "Have a safe drive," he said finally, and raised the barrier. She pulled out onto the state road and drove east for 3 miles, then pulled onto a dirt track that ran parallel to the perimeter fence through scrubland thick with cholla and ocotillo, and stopped the truck. She took out her phone and called the number she'd dialed from the room. "Tell me where we are," she said. The voice on the other end, it belonged to a man named Reyes, no relation to Dana, a former signals intelligence operator who now did freelance work that he described to his family as communications consulting, said, "Authentication is done. I've got 3 intercepts from the Sandglass operational window, time-stamped, unit-coded, chain verified. They're real and they're clean." "Who has them?" "Right now, me. I need a destination." This was the decision she had been building toward all night. The intercepts needed to land somewhere Hale couldn't reach, somewhere with enough institutional weight to make the documents stick, and enough independence to make them dangerous. The Inspector General's office was the obvious answer, and therefore the wrong one. The IG operated within a chain that Hale had already demonstrated he could access. The Senate Armed Services Committee had staff investigators with subpoena authority, but getting material to them through proper channels took weeks, and through improper channels was a different kind of risk entirely. She thought about Specialist Tran, 3 floors below a classified archive section in the Pentagon, staring at a Category Delta flag on a file that had been sitting in a pending queue for 9 years. "Pentagon," she said. "Internal audit track. There's an analyst who already flagged the file anomaly. He doesn't know what he has yet, but he flagged it, which means he's honest and he's paying attention. Route the intercepts to the audit queue under his case number." "You have his case number?" "I have his query ID. Dana pulled it this morning." A pause. "That's a thin thread." "It's the right thread." She watched a hawk cross the sky above the scrubland, riding a thermal perfectly still at the center of its own motion. People who do the right thing when they don't know anyone's watching are exactly the people you want holding evidence. "Give me the ID." She gave it to him. 2 hours, he said. "Maybe 3. Make it 2. She hung up and sat in the truck in the early morning quiet and waited, which was the thing she had always been best at. At 0800, Marcus Webb made his first call. He made it to a woman named Colonel Adrienne Cross, currently assigned to the Army Criminal Investigation Division's Special Cases Unit out of Fort Belvoir, who had spent the last 18 months working a procurement fraud investigation that had been generating interesting results in roughly the direction of Meridian Strategic Services and had been frustrated by the way certain threads kept going cold in the vicinity of senior officer involvement. Webb didn't tell her everything. He told her enough. Cross listened without interrupting, which was how she handled most things, and when he finished, she said, "How solid are the documents Blake produced in the inquiry?" "Originals exist and are authenticated. Copies are in Holloway's inquiry record." "Holloway's been recalled." "I know, which is why the copies in his record need to be pulled before someone with Hale's access can get to them." A silence. "That's asking me to move on a two-star general's inquiry record based on a phone call. It's asking you to protect evidence in a procurement fraud investigation you're already running," Webb said. "Those are two different things, and I think you know which one you'd rather be doing." Another silence, longer. "I'll need the intercepted signals data." "It's being routed now." "Through what channel?" "Pentagon Audit Queue, case number 77 Delta Nora. Your people can access it with a CID authorization pull." She wrote it down. He heard the pen scratching. "I need 40 minutes." "You have 30, Webb said, which was not how he normally operated, but this morning was not a normal operation. Nora was back on the state road by 0840, driving toward a diner 12 miles east of Red Mesa that she had eaten at once before, 7 years ago, under entirely different circumstances. It was the kind of diner that existed to serve the people who built and maintained things in the desert, contractors, surveyors, highway crews. And it opened at 0630 and served coffee in cups that were too large and food that was too much, and asked no questions, which were the only 3 things she currently needed. She took a corner booth with sight lines to both doors and the parking lot through the window, ordered eggs she didn't particularly want, and opened her laptop. Dana Reyes had sent a file 40 minutes earlier. Nora opened it now. A compiled summary of Meridian Strategic Services DoD contract history, pulled from public procurement databases, and cross-referenced with classified contract numbers Dana had accessed through her Fort Bragg clearance. It ran to 31 pages. She read it the way she read terrain, fast, systematic, prioritizing the features that didn't fit. Meridian had received 17 DoD contracts between 2009 and the present. 12 of them were routine, security consulting, logistics support, the kind of work that dozens of private contractors did for the military without incident. But 5 of them clustered in a specific window, 2012 through 2016. Those 5 contracts totaled $340 million. 3 of them overlapped directly with classified operations Nora had supported, and all 5 had been awarded through a procurement office whose authorization chain ran directly through the office of the Senior Special Operations Procurement Officer, Victor Hale. The contracts weren't just linked to operations she'd worked. They were linked to specific intelligence recommendations she had made, recommendations that, if followed, would have altered the operational parameters of those missions in ways that would have rendered Meridian services unnecessary or significantly reduced in scope. She had recommended against certain equipment contracts. The contracts had been awarded anyway. The operations had proceeded with Meridian's involvement. She had documented the discrepancy in 3 separate after-action reports. Those reports no longer existed in any official record. She closed the file, stared at her coffee. The shape of it was clear now, fully assembled, the way a target becomes clear when you stop looking for what you expect and start reading what's actually there. Hale hadn't just erased her record to protect himself from a subordinate who disagreed with him. He had erased her because she was the most dangerous kind of witness, one who had been present, who had documented, and who had understood in real time what she was seeing. The coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway.
80912. Her phone rang. Not a number she knew. She answered it on the second ring. "Ms. Blake." "Yes,
The voice was female, clipped, authoritative. The voice of someone who had spent a long time in institutional environments and had stopped softening her register for strangers. "My name is Colonel Adrienne Cross, Army CID Special Cases. I need you to tell me where you are." Nora felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet. Something smaller and more careful. The first sign that the thread she'd sent out had connected to something solid. I'm off base. State Road 114, approximately 12 miles east of Red Mesa. Are you safe? Currently, yes. I need you to stay that way. A sound of movement on Cross's end, the background noise of an active office. We pulled your inquiry documents from Holloway's record 40 minutes ago under a CID evidence preservation order. They're secured. I also have preliminary access to a signals intercept package that was routed through the Pentagon audit channel this morning. I haven't fully reviewed it yet, but what I've seen in the first 20 minutes is a pause, the specific pause of someone choosing words with legal precision. Significant. How significant? I've been running procurement fraud cases for 18 months, and I've been trying to get traction on Meridian for 11 of those 18 months. The intercepts you have provide the operational link I've been missing. Another pause. Ms. Blake, I need to ask you directly. How much do you have? Nora considered the question. The diner was filling up. A table of highway workers, a couple with a map, a single man at the counter reading a newspaper. Background noise. Normal human activity. She lowered her voice slightly. I have the 3 intercepts currently in the audit queue. I have authenticated originals of the Sandglass mission logs showing my intelligence submissions and the subsequent alterations. I have the original after-action reports from 4 operations between 2013 and 2015 that were later filed under different officers' names. She paused. And I have one additional document that I have not shared with anyone yet. A silence. What is it? A financial routing summary. Third-party document, not military in origin. It shows payment routing from a Meridian subsidiary account to 3 numbered accounts at a bank in Luxembourg, with transfer dates corresponding to the contract award dates on the 5 overlapping contracts. The silence on Cross's end lasted 4 seconds, which was long for a person who didn't seem like someone who spent time being silent. Where did you get that? From someone who used to work inside Meridian's finance division and who has been waiting for a reason to produce it for approximately 6 years. Is this person willing to testify? If they're protected, yes. I can arrange protection. Cross's voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an undertone of focused energy that Nora recognized as the sound a person made when they had just seen the thing they'd been looking for. Ms. Blake, I need you to come to Fort Huachuca, not Red Mesa, Huachuca, today. General Holloway is at Huachuca. I know, I'm also at Huachuca. I arrived this morning. A beat. General Holloway's recall order was fabricated. We identified that 45 minutes ago. He knows. He's waiting. Nora sat back in the booth. She looked out the window at the parking lot, where her truck sat between a work van and a pickup, entirely unremarkable in the desert morning light. How long a drive? She said. 90 minutes. I'll be there in 80. She was 60 miles out from Huachuca, on a highway that cut straight through flat desert scrubland with the mountains ahead of her building gradually in the windshield, when the black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. She noted it without reaction, a behavioral discipline so ingrained she would have had to think deliberately to override it. The SUV was 2 vehicles back, maintaining a consistent gap that was exactly the right distance to avoid being obvious to an untrained observer and exactly the wrong distance to avoid being obvious to her. She held her speed, watched the mirror. At the next junction, she took a right onto a county road without signaling, running the turn at speed. The 2 vehicles between her and the SUV went straight. The SUV took the right. 1 tail. Maybe 2 people inside. She ran the calculation without drama. 60 miles of open highway, 1 tail that wasn't particularly subtle, an 80-minute commitment she'd made to a CID colonel she had been talking to for less than 15 minutes. The obvious move was to call Cross and report the tail. The second obvious move was to take evasive action and route around it. She did neither. She picked up her phone and called Ortega. He answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless. She was pulling him off something. Blake, where are you right now? Base. Just cleared morning PT. What? I need you to do something, and I need you to understand that it is completely voluntary and that there is some professional risk attached to it. A beat. Okay. Go to the base communications center, not your personal phone, the center. Ask to speak to the duty officer. Tell them you have information relevant to the CID investigation of the Bravo 6 incident, and you want in a report directly to Colonel Cross at Fort Huachuca. Cross. CID. She's expecting contact from me. She'll take yours. Tell her I have a tail, black SUV, Arizona plates, County Road 44, approximately 40 miles north of Huachuca. Tell her I'm not stopping and I'm not changing route. You're not... He stopped. You're going to drive straight to them. I'm going to drive straight to them. Another beat. Why are you calling me and not Cross directly? Because if Hale has access to base comm channels, he already knows Cross's contact number is somewhere in my call log from this morning. If he's monitoring my calls, I don't want to give him Cross's direct line through my phone. She checked the mirror. The SUV was still there. Same distance, same gap. You're a clean channel. He doesn't know I called you from the public affairs office last night. She could hear Ortega processing that, running the same kind of sequence she ran, in his own way, which was part of why she'd assessed him as worth talking to in the first cafeteria conversation. Roger, he said, making the call now. Thank you, Sergeant. Blake, he paused. Watch your six. She already was. Fort Huachuca sat in the high desert at the base of the Huachuca Mountains, older than most of the controversies it had absorbed over its history. Its buildings a mixture of the historic and the utilitarian that gave the place the architectural texture of an institution that had outlasted several of its own identities. Cross met her at the Visitor Control Center personally, which told Nora something about the current temperature of the situation. Cross was 50, lean, with close-cropped gray at her temples, and the kind of posture that didn't come from parade grounds but from years of carrying something upright in situations where slumping was a liability. She shook Nora's hand with the directness of someone who had already decided to trust her and was simply confirming the decision. The SUV peeled off at the junction 6 miles out, Cross said. We had a camera on County Road 44. Who was it? Private security. Meridian's subcontract. She said it flatly, like a woman who had stopped being surprised by confirmations. They weren't authorized to interfere with you. They were following. Whether that's surveillance or something else, I don't know yet. They walked through the visitor center into a secure annex, a room with no windows and a conference table that had seen a great many difficult conversations, its surface scratched and ring-stained in the particular way of furniture that gets used in anger. General Holloway was already there. 2 JAG officers. A woman from the Pentagon Nora didn't recognize, who was introduced as a Deputy Inspector General's representative. Holloway looked at her when she walked in. His expression was careful. Not hostile, not warm, the controlled neutrality of a man managing a situation that had moved well past what he'd expected when he arrived at Red Mesa 3 days ago. Ms. Blake, he said, I owe you an apology. The recall order on my end was irregular, and I should have identified that before I complied with it. You identified it, she said. That's what matters. He nodded once, gestured to a chair. She sat. Cross sat beside her. The JAG officers arranged themselves with the particular careful geometry of people, conscious of appearing neutral. Before we begin, Holloway said, I need to ask you to produce the financial document you referenced in your call to Colonel Cross. I want it on the table before we go any further. Nora reached into her bag and removed a USB drive. The routing summary is on this drive. There's also a signed statement from the source, notarized, with contact information for verification. She set it on the table. The source will speak to investigators directly if granted protection. They have 8 years of Meridian's internal finance records, not summaries, the actual records. The woman from the Inspector General's office looked at the drive for a long moment. Then she reached out and picked it up with both hands, with the deliberate care of someone handling something that has just changed the scope of the problem they thought they were solving. I need to make a call, she said. There's a secure line in the next room, Cross said. She left without another word. What followed was 8 hours of the most precise and relentless institutional dismantlement Nora had ever witnessed from inside a room. Cross ran it the way a good sniper ran an operation, methodically, without drama, never rushing the shot. She pulled documents, cross-referenced them with the signal's intercepts, built a timeline on a whiteboard that started with Meridian's first contract award in 2012, and ran forward through 14 operational decisions, 9 personnel actions, and a procurement chain that wound through 3 different contracting offices before arriving, inescapably, at one authorization signature on every critical document. Victor Hale. By noon, two CID investigators at the Pentagon had accessed the financial routing summary from the USB drive and matched three of the Luxembourg account numbers against a classified financial intelligence database maintained for counterterrorism purposes, a database that contained those account numbers because they had been flagged 18 months earlier during an unrelated investigation as conduits for defense procurement fraud. The flag had been noted and shelved. It was now very much not shelved. At 1340, Specialist Tran Min received a call from a CID investigator who identified herself, asked him to stay at his workstation, and asked him to walk her through the Category Delta flag he had identified on Blake's file 2 nights earlier. Tran did this with the meticulous accuracy of someone who had been documenting his own findings in case exactly this call came, and when the investigator asked him to forward his query records to a secure CID evidence address, he did it in under 3 minutes. At 1520, a retired Special Forces warrant officer named Garrett, the man who had typed the call sign Iron Wraith into a secure chat network and sent it to 4 people, received a call from Cross's office asking him to submit a formal statement regarding his operational history and his knowledge of the unit Nora had served in. He had his statement prepared and ready. He had written it 4 years ago. He submitted it before the investigator finished explaining the secure submission portal. At 1610, General Hale was in his office at Red Mesa when his phone rang. His aide announced that Colonel Cross from CID was requesting to speak with him regarding the Bravo 6 inquiry. He had been expecting this call. He had a prepared response, measured, cooperative, the practiced openness of a senior officer who welcomed institutional review because he had nothing to hide. He had given versions of this performance before. He had given it in 2015 when the procurement audit first surfaced. He had given it twice more in subsequent years as peripheral inquiries reached toward him and then deflected away. He had survived every one of them. "Put her through," he said. Cross's voice came on the line without preamble. "General Hale, I'm calling to inform you that as of 1600 hours today, a formal CID criminal investigation has been opened under case number 774 Alpha Cross, encompassing allegations of procurement fraud, falsification of military records, obstruction of inquiry proceedings, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You are named as the primary subject of this investigation." Hale said nothing. "You have the right to retain legal counsel immediately, which I strongly advise. You are not currently under arrest, but I am directing you to surrender your base access credentials, your communications devices, and your travel documents to the Provost Marshal at Red Mesa within the next 60 minutes. You are not to contact any personnel currently listed in the investigation." A silence. "I want to speak to my attorney," Hale said. His voice was level, exactly as level as it needed to be. "That is absolutely your right," Cross said. "I'd like to point out that your attorney should advise you that we currently have signed financial documentation, authenticated signals intercepts, a corroborated personnel file discrepancy, and a witness with 8 years of Meridian's internal financial records who is presently in protective custody and has agreed to testify fully." A pause, brief, deliberate. "I'm telling you this not as a courtesy, General, but because I think you deserve to know what the actual situation is before you make any decisions in the next 60 minutes. Another silence, longer. "One more thing," Cross said. "The call sign Iron Wraith. 9 years ago, that call sign was buried in a classified file along with everything attached to it. Within the last 72 hours, it has been spoken on a secure network by 11 veterans, 3 of whom have already submitted formal statements. The other 8 are in contact with my office." A pause. "You erased a person, General. Turns out there were a lot of people who remembered her." She ended the call. Nora didn't hear about the call until later. At 1610, she was sitting in a small office off the main conference room at Huachuca, eating a vending machine sandwich that was marginally better than the base cafeteria version, when Cross knocked and opened the door. She looked at Cross's face and read it the way she read everything. Not for what it showed, but for what it was trying not to show. "Hale's been notified," Cross said. "How'd he take it?" "Like a man recalculating." She sat down across from Nora. "He'll lawyer up tonight and he'll fight it. This isn't over. It's going to be months of legal process, depositions, potential appeals. You understand that?" "I've understood that since 2015. Cross looked at her for a moment. "You've been carrying this for 9 years? Documents, contacts, financial sources. Waiting. She said it without judgment, but with the particular focus of someone trying to fully understand something. Why today? Why Red Mesa? Why that shot? Nora thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. I didn't plan the shot, she said. I planned being present. I planned being visible at an evaluation Hale would be running, with documentation I could produce the moment someone in authority asked the right question. She paused. The shot happened because soldiers were going to die, and I was the only person present who could prevent it. And Hale's reaction to the shot confirmed what I already knew. He went for the file within 23 minutes. She looked at her hands. A man who had nothing to hide doesn't check a lock he put on a door 9 years ago within 23 minutes of someone demonstrating they might have a key. Cross was quiet for a moment. You used the shot as a trigger. I used the shot to save 3 people's lives, Nora said. Everything else was already in motion. I just needed someone to ask who made it. The silence that followed was comfortable in the way that silences between people who understand each other sometimes are not empty, just patient. Then Cross's phone buzzed. She looked at it, read something. Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just the small controlled change of someone receiving confirmation of something important. The Luxembourg accounts, she said. Financial intelligence just matched 2 of the numbered accounts to wire transfers that occurred 48 hours before each of the 5 Meridian contract awards. She set the phone down. That's not circumstantial anymore. Nora said nothing. It's going to hold, Cross said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was an assessment, delivered with the same flat precision she used for everything else. Nora nodded once. Outside the office window, the Huachuca Mountains caught the last of the afternoon light. Long amber shadows falling across the high desert, in the particular way of late-day sun at altitude, turning the landscape into something that looked patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small, urgent dramas of the people living at its base. She had looked at mountains like that from a lot of different angles over the years. Through a scope, through a windshield, through a dirty window in a country that didn't have her name on record. She looked at them now and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not relief, which required the absence of tension, and the tension wasn't gone yet, something smaller. The specific quality of a breath taken after a very long time of controlled exhalation. The first real breath in 9 years. Somewhere across the base, in a secure communications room, the signals intercepts she had carried for nearly a decade were being formally entered into a federal criminal investigation record. And in an office at Red Mesa, 60 miles northwest, a 4-star general was making a phone call to an attorney who was going to tell him, for the first time in a very long career, that the ground under him was no longer solid. The first frost warning of the season came 2 days after the investigation went federal, which struck Nora as the kind of coincidence that meant nothing and felt like something anyway. She was in a borrowed office at Huachuca, not a proper assignment, just a room with a desk and a working phone that Cross had arranged, because the alternative was sending her to a hotel in Sierra Vista, and Cross was too pragmatic to put a key witness 40 minutes from the investigation site. The office had belonged to someone who collected topographic maps. They were still pinned to the walls in overlapping layers, all different scales, all different theaters. Nora found herself studying them in idle moments between depositions the way she'd always studied terrain, reflexively, professionally, the habit too deep to switch off even when the terrain in question was Afghanistan 2009, and entirely irrelevant to her current situation. She was looking at a 150,000 map of the Hindu Kush when Cross knocked and came in without waiting, which had become their operating rhythm over the past 48 hours. Hale's attorney filed a motion to suppress the signal's intercepts this morning, Cross said. She sat down in the chair across from the desk without preamble. Argument is chain of custody. The intercepts weren't obtained through official channels, and the authentication was performed by a private contractor. Reyes is credentialed, Nora said. 15 years signals intelligence, NSA contractor clearance. The authentication methodology is standard. I know, the motion won't hold, but it'll generate a hearing, and the hearing buys time. Cross set a folder on the desk. He's also filed a counter-allegation against you. Nora looked at the folder but didn't open it. He's claiming the documents you produced were fabricated, specifically that the mission logs and after-action reports were generated post-separation and backdated using classified formatting templates you retained without authorization. Cross said it flatly, without inflection. He has a digital forensics firm on retainer that's prepared to testify the documents show signs of recent generation. That's false. I know it's false. The authentication dating on the documents is solid. But it's the kind of allegation that requires a formal rebuttal process, which takes time, during which the primary investigation gets slowed by the counter-allegation track. Cross leaned back. He's not trying to win. He's trying to create enough procedural friction to negotiate from. Nora thought about that. Outside the office window, a logistics convoy was moving through the base. 5 vehicles, standard interval, the lead truck's radio antenna swaying slightly in the morning wind. She watched it until it passed behind a building. What's he negotiating toward? Our best read is a quiet retirement. He drops the counter-allegation, cooperates partially with the procurement investigation, takes administrative separation rather than court-martial. In exchange, the criminal fraud charges get reduced to administrative violations. No prison time, pension retained. Cross watched her. His attorney has made informal overtures to the JAG on our side. And the soldiers, Nora said, the ones whose mission parameters were compromised because he withheld my intelligence. The ones who came home broken because the operations went wrong in ways they never should have gone wrong. They don't factor into his negotiating position. No, they wouldn't. She opened the folder, read the first page of the counter-allegation. The legal language was precise and technical and had clearly been written by someone who understood how to build a framework of plausible doubt around a true thing. It was well crafted. She almost respected the craftsmanship. Almost. She closed the folder. He's going to be disappointed. The formal deposition proceedings began on the 4th day, in a conference room that had been converted into a semi-legal space with a court reporter and 2 JAG officers present, alongside Cross and the deputy IG representative, whose name Nora had learned was Patricia Sung, and who had the specific manner of someone whose entire professional identity was built on the understanding that institutions could betray the people inside them, and who had spent 20 years developing the forensic skills to prove it when they did. The first deposition was Nora's own, and it ran 9 hours across 2 days. Cross conducted it. She was precise and relentless in the way that good investigators were. Not theatrical, not aggressive, just entirely focused on the sequential establishment of fact, one verified point at a time, building a structure that would hold weight when tested. She asked Nora to walk through every operational deployment chronologically, every intelligence report submitted, every instance where a recommendation had been overridden or ignored, every communication with Hale's office, direct or indirect, in the years leading up to her separation. Nora answered everything. The discipline of it was its own particular kind of exhausting, not physically, but in the way that sustained precision was exhausting. The constant management of memory against the temptation to interpret rather than report, to frame rather than simply state. She had kept detailed personal notes precisely because she had always understood that memory, without documentation, was argument, not testimony. On the 2nd day of her deposition, Cross set a photograph on the table. "Do you recognize this?" The photograph showed 3 people standing outside a building Nora recognized as a forward operating base in a location she was not going to identify by name in a deposition that would become part of a federal record. The 3 people were in civilian clothes. 2 of them she didn't know. The third was Victor Hale. The photograph was dated. The date was 72 hours before the Tharsis Valley operation. "I recognize General Hale," she said. "I don't know the other 2 individuals." "The individual on the left is the CFO of Meridian Strategic Services during the period in question," Cross said. "The individual on the right is currently a senior partner at the law firm representing General Hale in this proceeding." Nora looked at the photograph again. "Where did this come from?" she said. "The woman in Meridian's finance division," Cross said. "The one who held the records for 6 years. She had this in her personal files. She photographed them. She photographed everything." Cross retrieved the photograph. "She's been in protective custody for 4 days. She's given us 73 hours of recorded testimony and produced documentation that covers every major Meridian contract from 2011 through 2019. A pause. "Her name is Elena Marsh. She was Meridian's head of financial compliance. She went to Hale in 2016, before she came to you, and told him she'd identified irregular payment routing in the contract awards. He told her the irregularities were classified operational disbursements,
and that if she filed a formal report, she would be charged with unauthorized disclosure of classified financial information. He threatened her. He threatened her. Cross said it with the flat certainty of confirmed fact.
She spent the next 6 years building a documentation record in case she ever found a channel she could trust. Nora sat with that for a moment. Elena Marsh, a woman she had never met, who had been sitting on the same truth from a different angle for 6 years, waiting for the same thing Nora had been waiting for. A question from someone with the authority to act on the answer. She found the right channel, Nora said. She found you, Cross said. Through Marcus Webb, 8 months ago. She didn't know who you were, just that Webb was building towards something involving Meridian. She decided to wait and see if it went anywhere. It went somewhere. It went somewhere, Cross agreed. Staff Sergeant Ortega arrived at Huachuca on the 5th day, transferred temporarily to support the investigation as a subject matter witness on the Red Mesa evaluation and the Bravo 6 incident. He appeared in the doorway of Nora's borrowed office at 1600 with his cover under his arm and the expression of someone who had spent 5 days doing paperwork and wanted to be doing something else. They have me writing a 12-page statement about a shot I watched someone else make, he said. 14 years of marksmanship and my contribution to this investigation is describing your wind call. Your wind call was accurate, she said, 2 minutes right off the mountain face. He sat down. I've been running that calculation in my head for 5 days. Every time I come up with the same answer, even knowing the wind, knowing the range, knowing the target position, I could not have made that shot. You might have. I wouldn't have. He said it without self-pity, just a straightforward assessment. What's the actual longest confirmed shot you've made? Not 3047. Before that. She looked at him. That's classified. Everything about you is classified. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What does it feel like after a shot like that? I don't mean the mechanics, I mean afterward, when you know you hit. It was the kind of question that most people didn't ask, and the people who asked it usually wanted a simple answer that would let them file the experience into a category. She had given the simple answer before. She didn't feel like giving it now. Like finishing a calculation, she said. The math was right, and then there's a second where the answer is just the answer, before anything else comes in. He thought about that. And then? And then everything else comes in. He nodded slowly, like someone recognizing something they'd known in a different form. He'd made shots. Not at that distance, not under those circumstances. But he knew the specific aftermath of lethal precision, the cognitive clarity followed by the weight of what clarity had required. The soldiers from Bravo 6 are here, he said. On base. Did you know that? She did not know that. 3 of the wounded plus the surviving crew. 12 people total. Cross brought them in as witnesses to the ambush circumstances. He paused. They've been asking who made the shot. Nobody told them, I think. Or maybe Cross is keeping it controlled. He looked at her. They would want to know. They'll know eventually. Yeah. He stood, replaced his cover. For what it's worth, I've been in this army for 14 years, and I've served under maybe 30 officers and senior NCOs. Some good, some bad, 1 or 2 genuinely dangerous. He paused at the door. Hale is the kind of dangerous that wears the right uniform and knows how to make the institution protect him. Or he was. He looked back at her. You've been sitting on the solution to that specific kind of problem for 9 years. I was sitting on evidence, she said. The solution still takes time. I know. He left. On the 7th day, the depositions widened. Cross's team had been working outward from the financial documentation, identifying every military officer whose name appeared in the Meridian contract chain with enough regularity to warrant questioning. The list was longer than anyone in the room wanted it to be. Not dozens, but more than a handful, and arranged in a hierarchy that told a story about how corruption embedded itself in institutions, not through wholesale conversion of entire offices, but through the careful cultivation of key individuals at critical decision points, each of whom could advance one part of the scheme while remaining plausibly ignorant of the whole. 4 lieutenant colonels. 2 colonels. 1 brigadier general whose connection to Hale ran back 22 years to shared service in an earlier assignment, and whose role in the scheme appeared to have been primarily passive,
receiving career advancement in exchange for asking no questions about procurement decisions that moved through his office. 3 of the 4 lieutenant colonels asked for counsel immediately. The 4th, a compact woman named LTC Renata Bose, who had run contracting administration for the Special Operations Procurement Office from 2013 to 2016, asked for a glass of water, drank it, set it down, and said she wanted to make a proffer without counsel present. Cross put that deposition on a 2-day expedited schedule and rearranged everything else around it. Nora wasn't in the room for Bose's deposition. She heard about it in pieces, through Cross, through Sung, through the careful calibration of information that Cross allowed to flow to Nora in recognition that Nora had context no investigator could fully replicate. What Bose produced was granular, specific meeting dates, specific language used to characterize the intelligence reports that were suppressed, specific names of the officers who had been assigned credit for Nora's operational work. One of those names was dead. A colonel named Ferris killed in a non-combat accident in 2018. 2 were retired, living civilian lives in Virginia and North Carolina, respectively. 1 was currently serving, a brigadier general named Calloway, currently commanding an installation in South Korea, whose official citation record included 3 operations Nora had supported and who had apparently built an entire senior career on the structural foundation of her erased one. When Cross told her Calloway's name, Nora was quiet for a moment. "I trained with Calloway," she said, "in 2007. He was a captain, good tactician, not exceptional, but solid." "He knew?" She thought about it honestly. He knew his citations were better than his performance warranted. Whether he knew the specific mechanism, she paused. "I don't know, that's for the investigation. He's been formally notified and placed on restricted duty pending outcome." Cross watched her. "How are you doing with all of this?" The question was direct and without condescension, which Nora appreciated. "I spent 9 years being angry about a specific thing," she said. "Now the thing is in the light, and the anger doesn't have the same grip. It's something else now." She thought about how to be accurate. "It's tiring, the way that being right for a long time is tiring when the proof of it finally has to be produced." Cross nodded. "The financial documentation for Marsh is being formally authenticated tomorrow. Once that's in the record, the suppression motion on the intercepts is effectively moot. We don't need the intercepts to establish the financial conspiracy, and the financial conspiracy independently supports everything the intercepts show." She paused. At that point, Hale's negotiating position collapses. He'll know that. His attorney knows it already. "We've received a second informal communication. He's moving his position." Cross said it without satisfaction, just reporting terrain. "He's willing to enter a guilty plea to a reduced charge set if we take the criminal fraud trial off the table." "What does CID recommend?" "I recommend we decline." Cross said it with the flat certainty of a person who had already run the analysis. "The financial records Marsh produced are sufficient for a criminal conviction without a cooperation agreement. If we take the plea, we lose the deterrent value of a full trial. Other people in that procurement chain are watching this outcome very carefully." "Other people in that procurement chain should be watching it very carefully." "Yes." Cross looked at her. "The IG's office agrees with my recommendation. It goes to the convening authority tomorrow." The convening authority was a 3-star named General Adela Reinhold, who commanded the Army's judicial oversight function and who had been watching the Red Mesa situation develop from Washington with the specific attention of a person whose institutional responsibility required her to care deeply about it, and whose personal instinct toward justice had not been worn down by 30 years of institutional complexity into the kind of comfortable pragmatism that sometimes passed for wisdom in senior ranks. She flew in on the 8th day. Nora met her in the same conference room where the inquiry had been sitting, which had acquired over the previous week the atmosphere of a room that had been seriously used, coffee rings on the whiteboard shelf, a stack of indexed folders on the side table, the particular organized density of a space where people had been working hard and close. Reinhold was 60, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the air of someone who had made many decisions and was prepared to make another one. She sat across from Nora without aides in the room. She had sent them out, which itself communicated something about how she was approaching the conversation. "I've read the full deposition record," she said. "The financial documentation, the intercepts, the witness statements, all of it.
She folded her hands. I want to hear from you directly. Not what's in the depositions. I have those. I want to know what you want the outcome of this to be. Nora looked at her. That's not a standard question for this kind of proceeding, she said. No, it isn't. I'm asking it anyway. She thought about it the way she'd been thinking about everything over the past 8 days. Not rushing toward the comfortable answer, not performing the expected humility of someone who had just been vindicated after a long time in the wrong, but actually sitting with the question and looking at it honestly. I want the people who are hurt to be acknowledged, she said. Not me specifically. The soldiers whose operations went wrong because the intelligence was withheld. The families of whoever didn't come home from those missions. The record needs to reflect what actually happened to them, not the official version that was convenient for a procurement scheme. She paused. I want Hale to face a court-martial, not a plea agreement, not a quiet retirement, a proceeding where the full record is produced and adjudicated by people with the authority to say clearly what it means. Reinhold listened without expression. And the other officers in the chain, Nora continued, Calloway, the colonels. I don't know what they each knew, and I'm not asking for specific outcomes. That's the tribunal's job. But I want them inside the same process, not separated out into administrative tracks that let the institution quietly absorb the damage without acknowledging it publicly. That's going to be a long process. I know. And your own record. The restoration. That's secondary. She said it and meant it. The record matters because it's true, not because I need it. I know what I did. The people I served with know what I did. The soldiers from Bravo 6 know someone made that shot. They don't know my name yet, but they know it was real. She paused. I'd rather the record be accurate than celebrated. Reinhold studied her for a moment. You have been waiting a long time. 9 years? That kind of patience. Does it cost something? The question was unexpected enough that Nora didn't have a prepared answer. She sat with it. Yeah, she said. It does. She looked at her hands. I didn't have much else going on in the meantime. It came out with the particular flat dryness of someone who had found, over many years, that the most honest things often sounded almost like jokes. Reinhold's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of someone recognizing honesty in an unexpected form. I'm declining the plea agreement, Reinhold said. A military tribunal will be convened with a full charge set. Your documentation, the financial records, the signals intercepts, and the witness depositions will form the evidentiary basis. She paused. This is going to be difficult. His defense will be aggressive. There will be days when the process feels like it's moving backward. I've been patient before. I know you have. Reinhold stood. One more thing. Your record restoration. Cross says the authentication of your operational history is complete and is ready to be formally processed. Medals, citations, classified commendations, mission logs. All of it can be restored to the official record within the next 2 weeks if you authorize the processing. Nora stood as well. Authorize it, she said. Done. Reinhold picked up her reading glasses and put them on, which was the physical gesture of a person returning to work. Thank you for waiting until the right moment to force this into the open, Ms. Blake. Some people would have gone public years ago, burned the institution down from the outside. Burning it from the outside doesn't fix anything, Nora said. It just gives everyone inside a reason to call the fire the problem. Reinhold looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, the way people nodded when someone said something true that they hadn't heard phrased quite that way before. She walked to the door and mug. That evening, Nora found the soldiers from Bravo 6, not through official channels. She walked across the base to the temporary quarters where witness personnel were being housed and asked a young sergeant at the desk if the Bravo 6 crew were available. The sergeant made a call, came back and told her room numbers. She knocked on the first door. The man who opened it was 32, built solid, with a healing laceration across his forearm and the alert stillness of someone whose nervous system had been running on operational heightening for the past 10 days and hadn't fully come back down. His name tag read, Vasquez. He looked at her, at the civilian clothes, at her face. Can I help you, ma'am? My name is Nora Blake, she said. I was the shooter. He stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then he turned back into the room and said, in a voice that was very carefully controlled, Guys, you need to come out here. They came out in ones and twos from the neighboring rooms. 12 people in total, various states of dress, various stages of the healing that followed from being in vehicles that had been shot at and burned and stopped on a desert road with no cover. They assembled in the corridor in the specific informal cluster of people who had been through something together and hadn't fully processed it yet. They looked at her. Nobody spoke for a moment. A woman, specialist, young, her left hand wrapped in clean dressing, said, "You're the one who made that shot?" "Yes." "From the range?" "Yes." Another silence. Vasquez had his arms folded across his chest, and she could see him working through something, an internal calculation that had the emotional weight of someone revising a story they'd been telling themselves about what had happened to them. "We thought it was a team," he said. "We heard one shot and we assumed. Multiple shooters. Coordinated." He paused. "One person." "One shot," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms. "We'd been hit for 4 minutes," he said. "My vehicle commander was down. We had 2 people who couldn't move. The shooter on that ridge was taking his time, like he was waiting for us to break cover." He stopped. "1 more minute and someone would have broken cover." She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be better than the silence. The young specialist with the wrapped hand stepped forward. She was trying very hard to maintain the professional composure of a soldier in a corridor on an active military installation, and it was mostly working. "Thank you," she said. It came out with the specific weight of 2 words carrying everything that couldn't be said around them. Nora looked at her. At all of them. 12 people who were alive because the math had worked, and the wind had held, and 9 years of suppressed history had placed her on the right range, on the right morning with the right rifle. "You're welcome," she said. It was the only honest answer. She walked back across the base in the cooling evening air, the mountains dark against a sky that was going deep blue at the edges and still holding a thin line of copper in the west. Her boots on the pavement, the smell of desert cooling after a hot day, a smell she associated with more places than she could count, all of them different, all of them versions of the same fundamental landscape, wide, patient, indifferent, and full of the kind of distance that either made you comfortable with solitude or broke you against it. She had become very comfortable with it. Her phone buzzed. Dana Reyes from Fort Bragg. She answered. "It's on the wire," Dana said. "Iron Wraith. CID opened a formal investigation, Hale named as primary subject. Tribunal pending. It's going through the veteran networks right now." A pause. "People who served in classified units that officially don't exist are currently typing your name into secure forms they're not supposed to be using from their personal phones." "Tell them to use their work phones," Nora said. Dana laughed, a short, real laugh that released something that had been held for a long time. "Garrett wants to know if you're okay." "Tell him I'm okay." "Are you?" She stopped walking, stood in the middle of the base road in the cooling dark with the mountains on 3 sides and the distant sound of a vehicle somewhere on the perimeter. "Yeah," she said. "I think I actually am." Dana's laugh faded on the line, and the silence that replaced it was the comfortable kind. 2 people who had been carrying the same weight long enough that they no longer needed to describe it to each other. "Get some sleep," Dana said finally. "You too." She hung up and stood there another moment in the desert dark, then walked back to the borrowed office with the topographic maps on the walls, and slept better than she had in years, on a cot that was too narrow and a pillow that was too flat, which was also better than she had in years, because the quality of sleep she'd been managing for 9 years had less to do with the mattress and more to do with what she was carrying when she lay down. Tonight she was carrying less, not nothing. The tribunal was still ahead. The legal machinery that Hale's attorneys would deploy was still ahead. The slow, grinding institutional process of restoring a record that had been deliberately destroyed was still ahead. None of that was resolved. None of it would be resolved cleanly or quickly or without cost. But the door was open, and the right people were standing on the other side of it. She slept. The tribunal convened 6 weeks later at Fort Belvoir, which was Cross's institutional home, and which had been selected as the venue partly for logistical reasons, and partly because the presiding judge, a brigadier general named Warris, who had spent 20 years in military law and who had a reputation for zero tolerance of procedural theater, was based there and had specifically requested the assignment after reviewing the preliminary case file. Nora drove to Virginia, which took 4 days and covered terrain she had crossed before under different circumstances. She stopped in Albuquerque and had dinner with Reyes, the signals intelligence contractor, in a restaurant near his house where the green chili was legitimate, and the service was slow and they talked for 3 hours about nothing directly related to the investigation, which was exactly what both of them needed. He looked tired. He had been dealing with authentication review requests for 6 weeks, and the particular grinding bureaucratic friction of having done something right through unofficial channels in a system that preferred official ones. "When this is over," he said, "I'm taking 2 weeks off, and I'm not answering any phone that isn't my kids." "That's a good plan." "I haven't had a good plan since this started." He refilled her water glass. "How are you feeling about Belvoir?" "Ready? Ready like calm, or ready like wound up?" She thought about it. "Ready like I've been ready since 2015, and I'm slightly impatient with the remaining distance." He nodded. "He's going to fight it hard." "I know. His attorneys are good. So is the evidence." He looked at her across the table, the specific look of someone who had spent 6 weeks processing the full scope of what they'd gotten themselves into and had arrived at a settled place with it. "You know what I keep thinking about? The soldiers on that convoy. The ones who went into Tharsis Valley on bad intelligence. Not the ones from Bravo 6, the earlier ones. The ones from the operations in 2013 and 2014. I think about them too. Did you know any of them?" "Some." She set down her fork. "There was a team leader named Corporal Rice, 26 years old, out of Fort Lewis. He went into a compound in 2014 that my intelligence report had flagged as a high-complexity target requiring additional assets. The request for additional assets was denied. The report was modified before it reached the mission brief. The compound was underestimated." She stopped. "Rice came home. 2 of his team didn't." Reyes was quiet. "I wrote their names down," she said, "the day I left the army. I've written them at the top of every personal note I've taken since then." She picked up her fork again. "I'm not doing this for me. I want to be clear about that. I'm doing this because Rice deserves to know what actually happened, and because the 2 people who didn't come home deserve to be in the accurate record of why." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then let's make sure the record is accurate," he said. The tribunal lasted 11 days. Nora had expected it to feel like a culmination, like arrival. The way long missions felt when the final phase executed and the objective was reached. Instead, it felt like work, careful, sustained, sometimes tedious work that required her to hold a very specific kind of attention across hours of legal procedure that moved at the pace of institutional due diligence rather than operational urgency. She testified for 3 days. Hale's defense attorneys were exactly as good as advertised, a team of 4, led by a civilian named Hargrove, who had made a career defending senior military officers in complex fraud cases, and who was skilled at the particular technique of attacking the credibility of evidence by attacking the credibility of the person who produced it. He was methodical and controlled, and he never raised his voice, which was its own kind of pressure. On the second day of cross-examination, he spent 4 hours constructing a question about her motivations. Not in 4 consecutive hours, in pieces, spread across multiple lines of questioning, each piece seeming independent until the final synthesis. That Nora had a documented history of conflict with General Hale dating to 2013. That her separation from the Army had left her with grievances that were personal as much as professional. And that the documentation she had spent 9 years collecting could be understood as the product of a sustained personal campaign rather than an objective record. She listened to the whole construction without expression. When he finished, he looked at her with the calm confidence of someone who had just placed the last stone in a wall. "Ms. Blake, isn't it possible that your perspective on General Hale's decisions has been colored, over 9 years, by the personal grievance of separation?" She took 2 seconds before answering, not for effect, because she was being accurate. "No," she said. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. "Can you explain why not?" "Personal grievance would have made me go public 9 years ago. Personal grievance would have motivated me to reach out to journalists, to congressional offices, to veteran advocacy groups. I had the documents. I had the contacts. I had every resource I needed to make this public anytime I chose." She kept her voice level, factual. I didn't do any of that. I waited for an opportunity to bring the evidence through official channels, because I understood that the outcome of an official proceeding was the only thing that would produce actual accountability as opposed to media attention. The difference between those two things is significant, and I was willing to wait 9 years for the right one. She paused. That's not how personal grievance works. That's how patience works. Hargrove looked at her, said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he moved to a different line of questioning. Elena Marsh testified on the 6th day. She was 51, slight, with the composed manner of someone who had spent 8 years waiting to say something true in a room where it would matter. She had spent those 8 years building a case file with the methodical precision of a trained financial compliance officer, time-stamped, cross-referenced, redundantly backed up, organized into a structure that could withstand forensic review. When she sat in the witness chair, she answered every question with the specific clarity of someone who had rehearsed nothing because she didn't need to. She just remembered. She had been remembering on purpose for 8 years. On cross-examination, Hargrove attempted to establish that her records were selectively compiled, that she had kept documentation of irregular transactions while ignoring evidence of legitimate ones, creating a distorted picture. Marsh looked at him with the expression of a person being asked to validate something they find genuinely absurd. I kept everything, she said. Every transaction, regular and irregular. The ratio of irregular to regular speaks for itself. If you'd like to review the complete record, it runs to approximately 14,000 pages. I can have it provided to you. Hargrove did not ask for the 14,000 pages. LTC Renata Bose testified on the 8th day and provided the institutional connective tissue, the specific mechanics of how altered documentation moved through the procurement chain, which authorization windows were used, and which personnel at which levels had access to the modifications. She testified in the precise, unsentimental manner of someone who had decided that the cleanest exit from a situation she'd allowed herself into was complete accuracy, and she delivered it without visible remorse and without visible deflection, which Nora respected as the most honest version of a difficult thing. Warrant Officer Garrett, retired, testified on the 9th day about the operational history of the classified unit Nora had served in, the missions, the call signs, the personnel, and the specific performance record that had earned the unit its classification. He was 63 and had the weathered physicality of someone who had spent 30 years doing hard things in difficult places, and he testified with the blunt directness of a man who had decided to stop being careful about it. Iron Wraith was the best long-range shooter I served with in 30 years, he said, and I served with some exceptional people. What happened to her record is the worst institutional failure I witnessed in my career. Not because she deserved better, though she did, but because the falsification of combat records puts real lives at risk. Every officer who got a citation for a mission she ran went into their next assignment with credentials they hadn't earned. That's not paperwork. That's people's lives depending on a lie about what someone is capable of. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment after that. The presiding judge, Warris, made a note. On the 11th day, the tribunal deliberated for 7 hours. Nora spent those 7 hours outside on a bench near the installation's historic parade ground, in the November cold that had settled over Northern Virginia, with the flat gray insistence of a season that wasn't asking permission. She had a cup of coffee that went cold, and she didn't replace it. Ortega sat with her for 2 of the 7 hours without saying much, which was exactly the right amount of conversation for the situation. At one point he said, "Whatever happens in there, the shot is real. That doesn't change." "I know." "And Bravo 6. "I know, Ortega." He nodded. Went back to looking at the parade ground. At hour 5, Cross came out and sat on the other end of the bench. She didn't say anything either, just sat. 3 people on a bench in the November cold, waiting. At hour 7, Cross's phone buzzed. She read it, looked up. "Verdicts," she said. Victor Hale was found guilty on all primary charges: procurement fraud, falsification of official military records, obstruction of military justice proceedings, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The financial evidence, combined with the signals intercepts in Marsh's testimony, had been sufficient to establish the conspiracy's architecture beyond the reasonable doubt threshold required by military law. His 4 stars were removed. His pension was forfeited. He was sentenced to 12 years confinement at a federal military facility. His attorney announced an immediate intention to appeal. Judge Waris, in delivering the verdict, stated for the record that the conduct represented in the case constituted a deliberate and sustained corruption of the institutional trust that makes operational military effectiveness possible, and that the length of time the conspiracy had remained undetected reflected systemic vulnerabilities and oversight mechanisms that this tribunal recommends be formally reviewed. Brigadier General Calloway, facing separate charges of accepting fraudulent citations and obstructing record restoration inquiries, entered a guilty plea on the 7th day of the main tribunal rather than face the full charge set. He was reduced in rank, stripped of the citations that had been improperly transferred to his record, and given a general discharge. He would not serve prison time, which was the thing Nora had complicated feelings about, and which she allowed herself to have complicated feelings about without resolving them, because some things didn't resolve cleanly, and pretending otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. 2 of the 4 lieutenant colonels were found guilty of lesser charges and received reductions in rank. The 3rd received a formal reprimand. The 4th was cleared, his involvement determined to have been insufficient for criminal culpability. He had signed documents without knowledge of their altered nature, and the evidence didn't reach far enough into his understanding to hold. Meridian Strategic Services lost all active DoD contracts on the day the financial verdict was entered. A federal grand jury had already been convened in the Southern District of Virginia to address the civilian criminal liability of Meridian's executive leadership, including the CFO, who appeared in Elena Marsh's photograph. The formal record restoration ceremony was not what Nora had expected. She had expected, when she allowed herself to think about it at all, something institutional and procedural. A document signing, a room with people in dress uniform. Something that felt like the bureaucratic corrective it technically was. What happened instead was smaller and more real. Cross handed her a folder in the same borrowed office at Huachuca, where she'd been working 3 months earlier, the topographic maps still on the walls because nobody had gotten around to removing them. The folder contained a printed summary of the restored record, every operational deployment, every confirmed engagement, every classified citation and commendation, restored exactly as the original documentation recorded them. 12 operational deployments, 4 classified commendations, 2 service citations. 1 Distinguished Service Medal that had been awarded in 2014, entered into a classified record under a code designation, and then quietly buried when her file was sealed. She read through it. The names of the missions, the dates, the location she knew by terrain rather than by the designations on these pages. The specific technical language of military commendations that translated human experience, dangerous, cold, frightening, sometimes grievous human experience, into the flat formal sentences of institutional recognition. She read all of it, then she closed the folder. "Thank you," she said. Cross looked at her. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Like reading someone else's history," she said, and then remembering it's mine. Well, she went back to Red Mesa one more time. Not for ceremony. The formal ceremony was weeks away, and she had complicated feelings about ceremonies in general that she'd spent a career managing. She went because she needed to stand at the firing position again. Not for any operational reason, just to stand there. The range was quiet on a Tuesday morning in December. The desert cold and the light coming in flat from the east. The kind of winter morning that stripped the landscape down to its essential geometry. She parked in the contractor lot and walked to the range without speaking to anyone, carrying nothing except herself. She stood at the bench where she had set up the Barrett 10 weeks earlier. Looked east. The mountains at the far edge of the range were the same mountains. The terrain between here and 7-7-4 was the same terrain, the same flat hardpan, the same thermal column zones, the same pressure variables off the northeast face. Nothing out there had changed because something in here had changed. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes. She wasn't reconstructing the shot. She wasn't honoring the moment. She was just being present in a place where something true had happened, the way you return to places where true things had happened, not because the place held them, but because you needed to confirm that you did. She was still there when she heard boots on the range gravel behind her. She didn't turn immediately, finished what she was doing, which was nothing visible and everything necessary. Then she turned. Ortega stood 6 feet back with his hands in his jacket pockets
and the expression of someone who had calculated that this might be where she was and driven out on the chance. Somebody at the gate said they saw your truck. Small base. Yeah. He came to stand beside her and looked east at the same terrain. After a moment, "You going to take the command position they offered?" She had been offered a position 2 weeks after the tribunal, a senior advisory role in the Special Operations Community's newly forming Long-Range Engagement Doctrine program. Good work, real work. She would have had the authority to do it correctly and the context to do it honestly. "No," she said. He waited. "There's a program at Fort Carson, training pipeline for long-range precision shooting, restructured after a review that came out of all of this, actually. The review found that the doctrine had been underdeveloped for a decade in ways that tied directly to the procurement decisions Hale was making." She paused. "When you strip the money out and replace the equipment contracts with honest assessment of what shooters actually need, the training gaps become obvious. There's a lot of work to do at the foundation level. You want to fix the foundation. I want to teach." She said it without apology or explanation. "I spent 15 years doing the work and 9 years waiting to be heard. At some point, the most useful thing you can do is make sure the next generation doesn't need 15 years and 9 years of waiting to get their footing." He looked at her sideways. "You'd be good at that." "I know." A pause. "I'm not entirely comfortable with it yet. That's usually a sign it's the right thing." He almost smiled. "When do you start?" "February." They stood there a moment more in the December cold, looking at the distance. Somewhere out there, at 3,047 meters, there was a section of rock face with a gap between two boulders that the desert would slowly fill in over the next few decades until nobody could tell anything had ever happened there. The desert was patient that way. "I have a question," Ortega said, "and you don't have to answer it. Ask." "Iron Wraith." He said the call sign with the specific care of someone who understood its weight. "When they gave you that, were you proud of it? Or did it feel like—" He searched for the word reduction, like they were naming the skill instead of the person. She hadn't been asked that before. She stood with it for a moment, felt its edges. "Both," she said. "Call signs do that. They compress you into your function, useful in the field, complicated everywhere else." She looked at the mountains. "But you carry the name someone gives you because you were there when they gave it, and because the people who gave it are real to you, and because even a compression contains something true." He nodded slowly. "What do you want to be called now?" he said. "If you could choose." She thought about it. "Blake," she said. "Just Blake. The way it's always been between people who actually know each other." The ceremony at Red Mesa happened on a Friday in January, which was cold enough that the dress uniforms were worn over thermal layers, and the speeches were shorter than planned because nobody wanted to stand in the wind longer than necessary, which Nora found she actually appreciated. General Reinhold presided. Cross was there. Holloway. Dana Reyes, who had flown in from Fort Bragg. Marcus Webb, who stood in the back and said nothing and didn't need to. Garrett, retired, in a civilian suit that looked like it had been bought for the occasion and was slightly wrong in the shoulders, which was also exactly right. Elena Marsh, who had driven from Virginia and stood near the edge of the assembled group with the quiet particular presence of someone who had played a significant role in something and was not sure yet how to hold that. Ortega was there in full dress. He stood at attention with the specific straightness of someone taking the occasion seriously, which he was. 12 members of Convoy Bravo 6 were there. Vasquez. The young specialist with the wrapped hand whose name was Diaz and who had returned to duty 3 weeks earlier. 10 others whose faces Nora had memorized in that corridor conversation and who stood now in the January cold with the particular bearing of soldiers present for something they considered worth being present for. Reinhold read the formal restoration language. The citations, commendations, and service record entries were entered into the permanent official record, and a copy of the restored file was presented in the folder that Nora had last seen on Cross's desk at Huachuca. Then Reinhold paused. She looked at the assembled group. At Nora. "The Distinguished Service Medal awarded in 2014 was never formally presented," she said. "Due to the circumstances of its suppression, the presentation was never conducted. We're correcting that today." She pinned it herself. Nora stood still while it was done. The medal was exactly what medals were. A small physical object standing in for something that could not be made physical, which was everything that had been spent to earn it. All the cold and the distance and the calculations and the weight of the decisions made alone in the field at moments when there was no one to consult. It didn't contain any of that. It just pointed toward it, the way a compass pointed toward a direction it could indicate but never reach. "Thank you," Nora said, quietly, directly to Reinhold. Reinhold nodded. "You waited a long time. I had good reason to think it would be worth it." After the ceremony, people gathered in the warmth of the range facility's main building, the informal clustering of an event winding down. Coffee appeared. Someone had arranged food that nobody had asked for, but everyone was eating. The particular social loosening of people who had been standing at attention and were now standing at ease. Dana found her near the window. "How do you feel?" she said. "You all keep asking me that. We all keep meaning it." Nora looked out the window at the firing range, which was empty and cold and entirely ordinary in the January light. Just a stretch of hardpan with target markers at increasing distances, the kind of infrastructure you'd find at dozens of installations across the country, built for the specific and serious purpose of teaching people to be accurate under pressure. "I feel like I have work to do," she said. "The good kind." Dana put her arm around Nora's shoulders. Briefly, the way people did when words ran out and contact was simpler, and then let go, because they were both people who ran out of words at approximately the same point and valued the directness of reaching that point together. Vasquez found her before she left. He was in uniform, cover under his arm, and he had the look of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for the past 2 hours. "My daughter is 8, he said. "She asked me what happened out there, what saved us." He stopped, restarted. "I told her a soldier made a very difficult shot from a very long distance because the training was right, and the discipline was right, and the person had spent a long time getting very good at something very hard." He looked at Nora directly. She asked if the soldier was brave. Nora waited. "I said yes," he said, "but not just for the shot, for everything before it." She held his gaze. There was nothing to say to that would be better than the weight of the silence around it, and she had learned long ago to trust that weight. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He put his cover back on and walked away, and she watched him until he reached the group near the coffee table and was absorbed back into the ordinary human motion of people talking and warming their hands and moving on. She drove back to her motel. Different motel this time, same general desert, same flat scrubland and water treatment facility view. And she found she didn't mind it. She had never needed the view to be good. She just needed the room to be functional and the night to be quiet. She set the Barrett case against the wall. Then she sat on the bed and opened her notebook. The same notebook she had been keeping since 2015, the one with the names at the top of every page. She turned to the most recent page. The names were there. Rice's team. The 2 who hadn't come home. She had written them at the top so many times over so many years that the pen pressure was different there. Heavier, more deliberate, the mark of repetition. She sat with the page for a moment. Then she wrote, below the names, "The record is accurate now. It says what happened." She closed the notebook. Outside, the desert was dark and cold and vast, which was how it always was and how she had always preferred it. The kind of landscape that made no promises about what it contained, that required you to read it carefully rather than assume it was what it appeared. She had spent her life in those landscapes, learning to read what wasn't visible, learning to wait for the right moment, learning that the most difficult shots were the ones that required you to hold completely still while everything around you moved. The Barrett case leaned against the wall in the dark. Worn canvas, cracked scope caps, a pistol grip smoothed by 10,000 repetitions of the same grip. A rifle that was 15 years old and that everyone at Red Mesa had looked at the way people looked at something they'd already decided was finished. It had not been finished. Neither had she. She was going to Fort Carson in February to teach the next generation of shooters how to read wind, how to hold still, how to make calculations under pressure, and how to understand that the weapon was never the hardest part of the work. The hardest part was keeping your integrity intact in an institution that sometimes asked you to compromise it, and finding, when it did, the discipline and the patience and the courage to hold your position until the truth had room to breathe. She turned off the light, slept. The greatest distance a person can close is not measured in meters. It is measured in the years between what happened and the moment the record finally says so.
and in the courage it takes to keep the truth alive across all the silence in between.